Well, hello. As you know, my name is Mike Pucciarelli, and tonight we'll be talking about how I use Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop with light painting. And I'm just talking about the Photoshop section. I'm going to quickly share my portfolio. So we'll be going over some of these files tonight. And I'll show the rest of my portfolio as experimenting with the variable N neutral density filter, the horses and acetique. This is my other type of photography, my plexiglass reflection or black plexiglass. Another light planing. So I'm going to start with the screenshots. This will help clear any confusion. I'm first going to start with Adobe Photoshop. And I work with raw files with Adobe Photoshop. So this is the basic session of the Adobe Camera Raw. Now, there are many ways to use this in HDR photography. I can zero out the highlights. I can plus out the shadows, -100, negative plus 100, -100, or -30 plus 30. I can decrease the contrast. I can increase the exposure, and I can affect the settings. But in light painting, I just want to, I want to leave all this alone. And I could either set the white balance, I could set the gray card and set the white balance, or I could not do anything because the base file is going to be a dark file. I leave all this alone. I don't touch this during light painting. This is one way to make the raw file a little more contrasty with an S curve. But in light painting, I don't touch this. And I rarely ever use these sliders. If I use this, I make the S curve up here. Sharpening. I know some people, they like to use certain measurements, like for portraits, 120, products are 140. And you can use noise reduction 50. You can use color noise, but the best thing to do is not to even touch this. But if you want to take out some noise, I'd use a color noise reduction. I would maybe go to 200%, and I would move this until you don't see any black spots. But in light painting and all my other still photography, I don't touch this. And you want to make sure you end in fit and view after you do your percent to view the desired size. This is very important. I use this in all my still photography. I always want to check off remove chromatic aberration. And I always want to check off use profile corrections. And tells in the profile correction, talks about the lens profile. If I were doing light painting, it would say 35 meter. And it gives all the lens information. Remove chromatic aberration. It straightens out color problems at the edge of the lenses. Like I said, for all my still photography, I like to use a prime lens, 35 meter, 50 meter, 85. They're the sharpest. Now, in light painting, I don't really touch this, but if you want to quickly, correct some distortion, I just recommend, clicking the A. You can also straighten the verticals and horizontals. You can also use this last thing to straighten out a photograph, but in light painting, I don't touch anything here. Now, maybe I could get a vignette, but I try to do this with the light, where maybe a slight vignette. This is good to do in other types of photography, but light painting, you could, but those times I don't. Now, I'll be talking about the image processor when I process raw images into JPEGs. And there's several ways you can use this. I always like to use RGB, the color profile. You have more colors to work with. And then when I'm copying and pasting in Photoshop, I want to make sure I do not have this checked. But if I'm posting for the web, I do. So, there's two ways you can use it. If you want to post to the web, you want to, have this checked off. But if you don't want to have this checked off, because I don't want to mess around with the sRGB and the regular RGB profile. Now we're going to talk about Photoshop, where Photoshop can be used in so many ways, even in light painting, and especially light painting. This is basically for ACR Auto, where you want to select some raw files. I never use this, but this is great if you want to have more than, you want to have a few more raw files selected. And when I run this action, the auto align layer and auto blend layer will happen. It'll straighten out the photo. It does things automatically. This sometimes I can use in light painting, where I would make a copy of the background layer. I run this action, and it does auto tone, auto contrast, and auto color. So it first does this, and then this, and then the last thing is the levels. When I use actions, I use them in many ways. I use it either one action, or I do it in groups, where in this up here, I'm making a copy of the background layer, and then it says play action, it's going to play this action. And I have actions for everything, saving a JPEG, saving Photoshop, because I use Photoshop actions way more than menus. Now, regular still life photography, I use dodge and burn, where I burn with the luminosity blend mode, I dodge with the screen blend mode. In light painting, I may just use, a levels adjustment, and I would affect all the layers. I put all the layers in a group, and I would just use the contrast. And there are other ways to use the levels adjustment, and I'll talk about that in the demo. And my signature, I would just use in light painting, I would just use the white, type for the white signature. And then I like to use actions in groups, where if I call this action, this happens. And I have it set to 1.3. And then the speckle happens. And then the high pass. And the high pass happens. I set it to 10 or 11. And I always, when I use a high pass, I always want to use a soft light, because it's great for contrast. When I do a frame, this action is calling two other actions. And this calls, this action is called. Then it runs these steps, and then it calls this action. And then this action calls this action. And then I do the condition where if it's a landscape, the big width is called, which is down here, and the big height if it's not landscape. So I have a condition. This is what my photograph looks like when I run the action. The longest side is 4,000 pixels. So if the height were the longest, the height would be 4,000 and the width would be something else. And the resolution, I like to use either 200 or 300 pixels per inch. I want to make sure I check off the resample automatic. This is a good filter to use either in groups or by alone, or just one, filter. The amounts that I just have it at 200%, and I just want to concentrate on 1.0 for every pixel. I just want to focus on the pixel 1.0. And the threshold, I just like to use either between 6 and 7 levels, where it's great for contrast, and the photograph looks natural when I use 6 to 7 levels. Then I use other, background actions in groups where I called it a speckle, which is here. There's no prompt for this. The dust and scratches, which is here. And then the N-sharp mask, where I call this, and then I go edit fade. And I want to make sure this is at luminosity blend mode. So I say fade, and I'll say fade on sharp mask. It'd be the last, filter that I use. In other ways, I could use action in groups where the dust is the speckle, which is no prompt, and the N-sharp mask. So at this time, I decided not to use the fade and anything in these groups of actions. So when I save a JPEG, I do a quick, export where quality is 100. And when I convert to sRGB, and it'll save, the metadata. So when I click on the action, a prompt will come up, and I gotta, find where to save it. The next time I'm going to run this, I'll go to where I last saved the JPEG. This is a way to save for the legacy, where the JPEG quality will be 100, not 60. And it contains all the settings. Now, tonight, since we're talking about light painting, where how I paste is very, very important, where I'd open up a JPEG, I'd make a selection, I'd copy it, Control-Command-C, and I'll talk about this in the lab. Then when I paste in place, and I always want to end up in the light and blend mode, and you're going to be painting white on a black layer mask. Every time I copy, I always want to paste using this, action. Paste in place, and you end in light and blend mode. Now, sometimes I use frequency separation, but a lot of times in light painting, I don't. So the high frequency is great for cloning. Some people use a layer for every different type of cloning tool. And the low frequency is great for, frequency, like from filters, selections, because it's a different frequency. This is with a high pass, which is this. It's a linear light. And the low pass is a, normal blend mode. Black and white photography, where I could use a black and white action to make it look more soothing. And I would just use I would just pick one of these actions. And Black and white photography, that's a whole nother webinar, but there's a lot you can do with, when you decrease the saturation, decrease the vibrance, or, when you work with the channel mixer, you zero out the reds, you zero out the blues, you zero out the greens. There's a lot you can do with all these adjustment layers for black and white. My workflow looks like where I have my layers here, my tabs, my navigator. And these are my brushes. And I'll demonstrate this tonight. When I use a brush, I want to be at opacity 100. I want the flow to be like 15. And then when I want to light paint the background, the flow will be like 5%. We'll talk about that in the demo tonight. So now I'm going to go to Adobe Bridge. Whatever, and I always shoot raw CR3, and I convert everything to DNG. And so what I do is I would pick out the best ones based on the LED light. Then I would select both. So if this were used with a certain LED light, I would open in camera raw. I would say load settings. I'd find the whatever filter I use. I click open, and then I click done. This is the master art file where the finished product. And this is with the LC load Godex lighting stick, where I would, open camera raw. Make sure you select all the files, then load settings. And I think I did this with, let's see, LC 500, closed without scrim. And then I click done. And these symbols here means that it syncs with the white balance. I did this a different way. I think I did this opening camera raw. And you have this file selected where I would, find I think I did this with the scrim, and I click open, I click done. In my CR3s, and I only use JPEG just to help me with the cell phone if I'm doing Wi-Fi. I don't touch the JPEG. I work with the raw files. I work with the DNG files. These would be all my raw files. And I pick out the best ones. And this is with the power. So I would do, I would select all files. Open the camera raw. Then all the files selected. I'd say load settings, and I think I used the power, let's see, the power with the filter. I click done. So, and the symbols here means has the correct white balance. I'd select all the raw files. Open the camera raw. I'm going to select all the files, load settings, and I think I did this with the big fleece. I click done. It's just a matter of so just select the files, open camera raw. Make sure you select all the files. And I want to load settings, find the thing, and I click open, and I click done. So now when I do the JPEGs, I do Photoshop image processor, and I'll bring up that screen. Let's see. This is where I use the image processor. And since I start with, RGB, I work with sRGB, but I don't want to convert the profile. I don't want to mess the sRGB with the ARGB. That's why I don't want to have this checked when I copy and paste in Photoshop. If I post on a web, then I do. So I would just select all the raw files of DNG, and then I'd run this, and this will run where I'm not going to have this first thing checked because I already have all the settings I want synced. And I'll create these JPEGs, and this will not be checked because I'll be copying and pasting in Photoshop. Now I'm going to go to, let's see, Adobe Photoshop. Your screen a little smaller. There we go. So basically, these are all start with a dark file. And I want to use this where to get this, I just run this action where make base layer, where I just run and this action, when I run this action, goes this layer. And so basically, I just move the shadow slider all the way to the left. And it's nice and dark. And I'm going to open up a JPEG that I used for this. So when I did this, I open up a JPEG, I make a selection, and I don't always have to use the lasso. Sometimes I could just use the object selection, as long as I copy it. Control or Command C. And then when I run this action, where I paste in place and I set the blend mode to lighten. And it's so every time I run this action, this is going to be the first step, paste in place. And then the last step is going to be end in lighten blend mode. And maybe, you can have several selections in one JPEG. Light painting can contain, many layers. So to open up a new JPEG, make a selection, Control Command C, and then I'd run this action. This is another JPEG that I copied. Control Command C, and then I run this action. Paste in place, first step. And then you end in that light and blend mode. Now, usually I just light paints, you're painting white on a black layer mask. Now, while my opacity for regular light painting, want your flow to be 15. Now, suppose I paint too much here, then I would push the X key. Change the dark, and I hide what I don't want to see. And for regular light painting, I use flow 15. Then when I do the backgrounds, I'm going to use the flow to 5. I want to make a very, very big, brush. It's very faint, you barely notice it. Sometimes I could use, opacity of 5 or 15 for the floor, but a lot of times I like to use a big brush, flow of 5 for the, table background and floor wall background. Now use this layer to clean out the mistakes. And this is just an action where I run this action again, do the same thing. And run this. And make the screen smaller. So I could run many actions alike. On a black signature. When I throw a layer away, if you want to make this layer bigger, do Control or Command T. If you want to change the color, make sure you press the X, but I'm going to change the color back to white. You could also make the check mark, but I could also so now I'm going to I'm not going to save any changes. I'm going to demonstrate a frame. To get this frame, I'm going to do it again, but I can always, I'm going to create another frame. What I'll do is I'll break up another photograph. Bring it up. Let's see. I'm going to flatten the image. Then I run the action. I'm going to push F12. So basically, let me get out of here. What am I doing? Let's see. So what I'm going to do is, before I do the frame, I'm going to flatten the image. And then when I run the action, it should produce it nicely. And when it did the action, make my screen bigger, produces like, going to make my brush smaller. Produce a nice key lime stroke. Where I play this action, this action's played, does these steps, and then it plays this action, it calls it. And then this action calls other actions. And then this action, the condition, depending on the file size, if it's landscape, do the big width, which is up farther, and the big height. The big height is here. The big height is here. I push F12 to get back to the original file. I'm going to open up another file. I'm going to check the chat to see if there's any questions. Okay. Your screen bigger. So I'm going to disable all the layers. And these are all the settings that you want to know, the background action, the layers here. The first thing I do is I run that action, make base file, where I just drag the shadows all the way to the left. Then I would open up, I'm going to open up a JPEG. I would just, make a selection, do Control Command C, and then when I do light, I always run this action when I paste. So I gotta find the action. And not have the action ready when I do this. I'm gonna. There we go. Yeah, light paste. The paste in place, which is, one of the menus, submenus of paste special, paste in place. And light and blend mode. Every time, this is another JPEG that opened up. I run through the action, run through the action, run through the action, the action. And then when I light paint regularly, the flow would be, 15 to 16%. Going on. So when I paint the background here, I change the flow to 5%. And I make a very big brush. I do the same thing with the backgrounds. That's just an action. I run the action. I just, it's flatten the image. I go to my other actions, top actions. I'd run this and I produce the frame. Then when I want to save it, I can either run the action here. I click that action. It'll tell me where I want to save it, where quality 100, get the measurements. So posting the web, I want to have this checked. It already tell me the file size. So any questions? Feel free to unmute and speak. Go back to my presentation. And these are my groups, Facebook groups. These are my links. And I also record this recording on my YouTube channel, where my playlist, where I have equipment in still life and light painting. I have light painting in Adobe Photoshop. I have a whole section on the black flex table, white flex table, Adobe software. You saw the portfolio tonight. I showed you this. My fine art website. Myself Fine Art. Got a 30% for Easter. Sale slow going on. This is being recorded, so I will post this very soon. Here are my workshops at PPA, where I'll talk about the R6, Canon R6 and a white plex table, and the Canon R6 with a black plex table. So one's on a Saturday and one's on a Sunday. If you want to register, you just, go to this link. And I'm in Rockville. Maryland, so here it is. So I can pause for any questions. No questions? Okay, you can always email me. This email address, mpucciarelli2016@gmail.com, or you can just message me at Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. All right, I think I'm going to end the recording. I think I'll stop the presentation. I'll post the recording soon.